It's 1957, in a cave carved into the limestone walls of the Zagros Mountains, in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan. A team of archaeologists, led by Ralph Solecki, is digging through layer after layer of ancient sediment when they hit something that stops the entire excavation cold. A human skeleton buried tens of thousands of years deep in the cave floor. But the moment they start carefully exposing the bones, something feels wrong. One eye socket is crushed inward from an old, violent blow. The right arm ends abruptly, just past the elbow, withered and clearly useless long before this person ever died. One foot carries a fracture that healed badly, leaving what would have been a permanent, dragging limp for the rest of his life. On paper, this person should not have survived a single winter. Instead, the skeletal evidence says he lived for years, possibly decades. And that's the part researchers are still trying to fully explain, even now. Here's what you need to understand before we go any further. Survival in the deep Pleistocene wasn't about comfort, and it definitely wasn't about waiting for help. It was about constant, brutal self-sufficiency, day after day, with zero margin for error. You hunted large, dangerous animals at close range, or you didn't eat. You outran or outmaneuvered the predator, or you became its next meal. You kept pace with your group across miles of exposed, rocky terrain, or you got left behind in a landscape with no shelter and no second chances. Every one of those requirements demands two working arms, sharp vision, fast reflexes, and the ability to hear a threat approaching before it's already on top of you. This person, whoever he was missing almost all of that. And yet the bones don't lie. He didn't die from any of these injuries. He lived with them for a very long time. So who was this person, and how did he possibly survive? Let's start with what the skeleton actually shows, injury by injury. The blow to the skull, near the left eye, happened when this individual was still young, likely from a serious fall or a direct strike, and researchers believe it may have partially or even fully blinded him on that side for the rest of his life. The right forearm was gone, either amputated or left permanently withered by an old, severe injury, meaning an entire limb was functionally useless from that point forward. Then there's the lower body, a healed fracture in one of the bones of his right foot, poorly set, almost certainly producing a visible, painful limp for the remainder of his years. On top of all of that, skeletal analysis shows signs of a degenerative condition affecting his spine, one associated with chronic muscular pain and reduced mobility. Individually, any single one of these might be survivable, with enough luck and enough time to recover. Stack all of them together in an environment with zero medicine, zero permanent shelter, and predators actively targeting anything that looked slow or weak, and you have what should have been, by any reasonable estimate, a death sentence within months. Here's the thing. Every one of these injuries shows clear, unambiguous signs of healing. Not partial healing, and not the kind of rough mending that happens in a few desperate weeks. This is complete, long-term bone remodeling, the kind that only occurs over years of continued survival. Which means this wasn't a case of someone surviving one rough encounter and dying shortly afterward from the injuries or from starvation. This was a person who sustained catastrophic, disabling trauma relatively early in life and then kept living for years, and based on later dental wear analysis, quite possibly into his 40s, by the standards of his time and his species, that made him remarkably old. Now, here's where it gets even stranger. For decades, researchers studying this skeleton assumed the injuries you just heard were the complete picture. Then, in 2017, a fresh reanalysis of the skull, conducted by anthropologist Eric Trinkaus alongside researcher Sebastian Villot, turned up something nobody had caught before. Examining the ear canals in detail, they found dense, bony growths lining both sides, growth severe enough to physically block sound from reaching the eardrum. Their conclusion was that this individual would have experienced profound hearing loss, likely near total deafness, layered on top of everything else he was already dealing with. Take a second to actually sit with what that means in context. No warning growl from the dark, no snapping branch underfoot behind him, no approaching footsteps to react to. In an environment thick with large carnivores actively hunting the Pleistocene landscape, losing your hearing wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was arguably the single most dangerous sense a person in his position could lose, which raises the obvious question: how does someone who is missing an arm, walking with a serious limp, partially blind, dealing with chronic spinal pain, and now profoundly deaf, not just survive one difficult season, but live for years, possibly decades, in one of the harshest and most predator-dense environments our ancestors ever faced? Here's the answer, and it's the moment this entire story flips everything you probably assumed walking in. This individual wasn't a modern human being at all. He was a Neanderthal, known to researchers simply as Shanidar 1. He lived roughly 50,000 years ago in what's now northern Iraq. And if the word Neanderthal makes you picture a grunting, brutish caveman, incapable of complex social bonds or genuine compassion, this skeleton is one of the clearest pieces of physical evidence that flips that entire image on its head. Because there is no realistic version of this story where he did any of this alone. Trinkas, the researcher behind the 2017 reanalysis, put it directly: beyond the missing forearm, the limp, and everything else, the deafness alone would have made Shanidar one easy prey and left him fully dependent on the rest of his social group just to stay alive. Someone, or more realistically, an entire community, fed him, helped him move through difficult terrain, watched for danger on his behalf constantly, for years, on behalf of a member of the group who could no longer hear it coming himself. This was a species we've spent generations picturing as savage and purely instinctual, quietly disproving that assumption through nothing more than the condition of its own bones. But here's the part nobody talks about. Shanidar 1 isn't an isolated case, and that's honestly the part of this story that matters even more than his individual survival. Roughly 430,000 years ago, at a cave system in northern Spain called Cima de los Huesos, meaning the pit of bones, researchers working a site that's been excavated since 1976 uncovered the skull of a child. They nicknamed her Benjamina. Her skull shows a severe congenital deformity called craniosynostosis, a condition where the bones of the skull fused together far too early, before birth in her case, which almost certainly came with serious developmental and possibly cognitive effects for her entire short life. And yet the evidence shows she survived for years with this condition in a hominin population that existed even before Neanderthals branched off as their own distinct lineage. A child who, by any purely functional measure of usefulness to a hunter-gatherer group, contributed nothing to that group's survival, kept alive anyway. Then jump forward dramatically to Neolithic Vietnam, roughly 4,000 years ago, to a burial researchers labeled simply as Man-Back Burial 9, excavated between 1999 and 2007 at a site in what's now Ninh Binh province. This individual was a young man, likely suffering from a rare congenital condition called Klippel-Feil syndrome, which caused fused neck vertebrae, a permanently tilted head, and progressive paralysis. Researchers Lorna Tilley and Mark Oxenham, who studied his remains in detail, concluded he lived with paralysis from the waist down, and at best, extremely limited use of his upper body for roughly a decade before he died in a farming community with no access to anything resembling modern medicine. He couldn't feed himself. He likely couldn't reliably chew solid food on his own. He almost certainly couldn't move without direct physical help. And still, for 10 years, someone made sure he didn't die. 3 individuals, three completely different species and time periods, separated by hundreds of thousands of years and thousands of miles, with no possible cultural connection between any of them. And yet, in every single case, the exact same behavior shows up, written directly into the bones. Someone chose to keep them alive long after they stopped being able to physically contribute to the group's survival in any conventional sense. That's the real reveal buried underneath all three of these stories. We tend to imagine compassion and sustained care for the vulnerable as something that arrived alongside civilization, something that showed up alongside organized religion or written law or settled societies wealthy enough to have surplus food to spare on people who couldn't hunt or farm for themselves. The physical evidence says otherwise, and it says it plainly. This behavior predates all of that by an enormous margin. It predates agriculture. It predates permanent settlements. It predates writing by tens of thousands of years. In the case of Benjamina, it even predates our own species entirely. Long before humans ever built the first permanent shelter, they were already making the harder choice over and over across continents and across time, carrying someone who couldn't walk, feeding someone who couldn't hunt, standing watch for someone who could no longer hear the danger coming on his own. So the next time someone describes an ancient society as primitive or brutal or purely every man for himself, think about Shanidar 1, lying in that cave for 50,000 years. Remember that one of the oldest confirmed behaviors in the human story isn't violence. It's carrying someone who can't walk,